The neighborhood had always seemed like a quiet, idyllic place, with manicured lawns, evenly spaced sidewalks, and homes that looked almost identical. Beneath that uniformity, however, lived an association that thrived on control, enforcing rules that often bordered on absurd. It was in this very environment that a storm began to brew, one that no one in the neighborhood could have predicted. It started with something as simple as a mailbox. My grandfather had lived in the community for nearly 20 years. He was a man of habit, proud of the home he'd built and the family he raised there. His mailbox, an old but sturdy post that had stood at the edge of his driveway for decades, had a slight tilt. It wasn't broken, it wasn't unsafe, it was just aged a little crooked with time. To him, that mailbox was part of the house's character, a small sign of the years gone by. To the HOA, however, it was a violation. One morning, a letter appeared taped to the front door. Bold letters at the top read, "Violation Notice." My grandfather unfolded the paper with calm hands, though anyone who knew him could see the irritation flicker in his eyes. The HOA had fined him $50 for failure to maintain an approved standard mailbox. The wording was almost laughable. $50 over a minor tilt. He didn't argue. He didn't call the number listed at the bottom of the notice. He didn't even fix the mailbox right away. Instead, he set the paper down on the kitchen table, adjusted his glasses, and poured himself another cup of coffee. His calm demeanor, however, masked something deeper. Grandfather wasn't just any man in the neighborhood. He wasn't just another retiree passing his days with gardening and reading the morning paper. He was a lawyer, a very good one, and he had spent his career not just practicing law, but owning his own successful firm. What the HOA didn't realize when they fined him $50 was that they hadn't just picked a fight with a retiree and his crooked mailbox. They had picked a fight with a man who knew the law inside and out, who had spent decades dismantling cases far more complicated than this petty fine. And he wasn't the kind of man to take unjust treatment lightly. The HOA president, a woman named Sandra, had a reputation around the neighborhood. She was meticulous, demanding, and known for her lack of flexibility. People called her a Karen, behind closed doors, though never to her face. She prided herself on enforcing every bylaw, no matter how small, and she wielded the HOA handbook like it was a weapon. If a lawn wasn't mowed to the exact length, if holiday decorations lingered past the approved date, if a garbage bin was left in sight, Sandra was quick to send out notices and fines. To her, my grandfather's tilted mailbox wasn't a minor issue. It was a chance to flex her authority. She must have assumed he would grumble, pay the fine, and move on. That assumption would prove to be her first mistake. Grandfather didn't respond right away, but he made a quiet phone call to his office downtown. Though he was semi-retired, the firm still bore his name, and the team of attorneys who worked there respected him deeply. He explained the situation simply without dramatics. They didn't laugh, though the absurdity of it was clear. Instead, they listened carefully, and then they began to review the HOA's bylaws, their financial records, and their compliance with local regulations. For the next 48 hours, while Sandra strutted around the neighborhood confident that she had once again put someone in their place, a storm of legal paperwork was quietly gathering strength. My grandfather didn't fix the mailbox. He didn't mail a check for the fine. He went about his days as usual, pruning his rose bushes and greeting neighbors with his usual warm smile. But behind the scenes, the groundwork for something much larger was being laid. Sandra, oblivious, had no idea she was about to be caught in the very web she had spun for years. The $50 fine was about to cost her far more than she could ever imagine. As the sun set on the second day, the first legal notice was delivered, not to my grandfather, but to Sandra herself. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from his law firm, bearing his name in bold at the top of the letterhead. Sandra opened it in her kitchen, the same way my grandfather had opened hers 2 days before. Only this time, the contents would not be so simple. This wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. And Sandra was about to learn that in trying to enforce her power, she had provoked someone far more powerful than she could have ever anticipated. The letter Sandra received that evening was nothing like the notices she had grown so accustomed to sending out herself. It was printed on heavy paper, official in tone, and carried a weight that could be felt even before the words were read. She unfolded it quickly, expecting perhaps some petty attempt at defiance, but as her eyes scanned the first paragraph, her expression began to shift. The document wasn't just a complaint. It was a formal demand. It outlined, in precise legal language, the multiple violations the HOA had committed in their own operations. Every association has bylaws, but those bylaws themselves must be compliant with local and state regulations. In their eagerness to enforce, Sandra and her board had overlooked crucial details. My grandfather's law firm had found them. The letter pointed out discrepancies in how fines were levied, failures to provide due process for homeowners, and even irregularities in how the HOA collected and managed funds. The accusations were clear. The HOA, under Sandra's leadership, had acted outside of its legal authority in more ways than one. This was not an angry homeowner's rant. This was the work of a team of attorneys who knew exactly where to press. Sandra's face reddened as she read. She had always believed herself to be untouchable. After all, who would fight over such small matters? Most people found it easier to pay the fines and deal with the hassle. But now, staring at the letter, she realized at this time her target was not ordinary. She had stirred something she didn't understand. She crumpled the paper in frustration, tossing it onto the table, but the words still echoed in her mind. The demand was clear. The fine against my grandfather was to be rescinded immediately. Furthermore, the HOA was expected to provide a full financial accounting to homeowners within 10 business days. Failure to comply would result in immediate legal action. Sandra tried to reassure herself. She had dealt with angry residents before. They bluffed, they threatened, but they always folded eventually. Still, something about this felt different. The tone of the letter wasn't that of someone hoping to negotiate. It was that of someone preparing for war. The next morning, Sandra marched into the HOA small office, clutching the letter like a piece of evidence. She gathered the other board members, waving the pages in front of them as she explained what had happened. Some chuckled, dismissing it as a scare tactic. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware that they had, over the years, become lax in following proper procedures. But Sandra refused to show doubt. She insisted they hold firm, that to give in now would be to open the door to rebellion among all the homeowners. If one person could fight back successfully, then others might start questioning their authority too. She told them the mailbox fine would stand. $50 was nothing, but the principle, she argued, was everything. Meanwhile, my grandfather remained silent. He didn't appear at meetings. He didn't confront Sandra face to face. Instead, his firm quietly escalated. The next set of documents filed weren't letters, but official motions. Records were subpoenaed. A lawsuit was drafted and prepared for submission. What Sandra hadn't yet realized was that in refusing to back down, she had given my grandfather the very leverage he needed. Neighbors began to notice the tension. Word spread quickly that the HOA president was in some kind of legal trouble. Though few knew the details, whispers carried from one lawn to another. Some secretly cheered, long frustrated with Sandra's heavy-handed tactics. Others watched for curiosity, waiting to see how it would all unfold. 2 days after Sandra received the first letter, a second notice arrived. This one was even more direct. The firm was filing suit not only against the HOA, but against Sandra personally, citing breach of fiduciary duty and misuse of funds. The allegations were severe. If proven, they could cost her not just her position but her home. She read the notice 3 times over, her hands trembling. This was what she had expected when she fined a man for his crooked mailbox. She had thought it would be routine, another example of her control. Instead, it was unraveling into something she could no longer control. Her phone rang constantly that day, board members demanding explanations, homeowners demanding answers. Some were terrified of what this meant for the association. Others were quietly delighted, sensing the possibility of change. Sandra tried to maintain her composure, but inside, the panic was beginning to grow. For my grandfather, it was just the beginning. He had given her a chance to back down gracefully. She hadn't taken it. Now, he would show her exactly what it meant to play by the rules of law, rules she had so freely twisted for her own power. The $50 fine had sparked a fire. But by the end of the week, it was no longer about $50. It was about control, accountability, and consequences. And for Sandra, the cost was about to rise far higher than she could pay. The HOA fined Grandpa $50 for a crooked mailbox, but he wasn't just a retiree. He owned a powerful law firm. Within 48 hours, his attorneys uncovered financial mismanagement and filed suit against the HOA and its president, Sandra. What began as a petty fine escalated into foreclosure proceedings. Sandra lost her position, her reputation, and ultimately her house, while the crooked mailbox still stood proudly at the end of Grandpa's driveway.